The lunch rush was at its peak when the shouting began. Customers turned from their meals as a sharply dressed businessman jabbed his finger toward an elderly man sitting quietly by the window. The old man wore faded jeans, worn boots, and a weathered brown jacket. His silver hair was neatly combed, but nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or importance. "People like you scare away paying customers," the businessman barked. "Manager, throw him out." The cafe manager hurried over, forcing a polite smile that quickly disappeared when he looked at the old man's clothes. "I'm afraid you'll have to leave." The old man simply looked up and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" "No," the manager admitted. "But you're making customers uncomfortable." Across the room, waitress Grace Parker stopped in her tracks. Grace was no stranger to unfair treatment. As a single mother working 2 jobs to support her 8-year-old son, Ethan, she had learned how quickly people judge someone by appearances. She placed her tray on the counter and walked toward the table. "He hasn't broken any rules," she said calmly. "He's a paying customer, and he deserves the same respect as everyone else." The cafe fell silent. The manager's face turned bright red. "You work for me," he snapped. "Not for him." "I work to serve people," Grace replied. "All people." The manager didn't hesitate. "Then you're fired." Grace's heart sank. She untied her apron with trembling hands, fighting back tears as months of unpaid bills, rent notices, and her son's school fees flashed through her mind. The old man slowly rose to his feet. He looked at Grace with quiet appreciation before turning to the manager. "Are you certain this is your final decision?" "Absolutely." The old man nodded once. Then he reached into his pocket and made a single phone call. "I found her." Less than a minute later, the ground outside began to tremble. One after another, sleek black SUVs rolled into the cafe parking lot. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward the windows. And in that moment, everyone realized the quiet old man was never an ordinary customer. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as another customer stepped inside, but Grace barely noticed. It had already been one of those mornings. She had dropped Ethan off at school after reassuring him that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure herself. Their landlord had left another reminder about overdue rent, her old sedan needed repairs she couldn't afford, and her second evening job had recently cut back her hours. Still, Grace refused to let her struggles change the way she treated people. Every customer who entered the cafe received the same warm smile. "Good morning." "Welcome in." Some returned the greeting. Others barely looked up from their phones. It didn't matter. Grace believed kindness wasn't something people earned, it was something everyone deserved. By noon, the cafe buzzed with conversation. Plates clattered, coffee machines hissed, and waitstaff hurried between crowded tables. That's when the elderly man walked in. His clothes were clean but old. His boots showed years of wear, and the wrinkles on his jacket suggested it had seen countless winters. Several customers glanced at him before quickly looking away. One woman quietly pulled her purse closer. A young couple whispered to each other. Grace noticed. She also noticed something everyone else missed. The man's posture was straight. His movements were calm and deliberate. His eyes carried quiet confidence. When she greeted him, he smiled warmly. "Good afternoon. I'd like a cup of black coffee and today's soup, please." "Of course," Grace replied. As she poured his coffee, another customer stormed toward the counter. He was dressed in an expensive tailored suit, wearing a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his arm. "This is unacceptable," he complained loudly enough for half the cafe to hear. The manager rushed over immediately. "What seems to be the problem, sir?" "That man," the businessman said, pointing toward the elderly customer. "People like him belong in shelters, not restaurants." Grace froze. The old man quietly stirred his coffee, pretending not to hear. The manager approached his table. "I'm sorry, sir, but some of our guests are uncomfortable." The old man looked up peacefully. Have I disturbed anyone? No. Have I refused to pay? No. Then why should I leave? The manager hesitated before lowering his voice. This establishment has a certain image. Grace could stay silent. Most employees would have. She thought about Ethan. She thought about teaching him to stand up for what was right. If she walked away now, what kind of example would she be setting? Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped beside the table. He's done nothing wrong. The manager frowned. Grace. He paid for his meal. He's polite. He's following every rule. The businessman scoffed. So now the waitress is giving management lessons. Grace ignored him. He deserves to finish his lunch. The manager's patience disappeared. I've made my decision. And I've made mine, Grace answered. I won't help humiliate someone who has done nothing wrong. For several seconds, the room remained perfectly still. Then came the words that changed everything. Take off your apron. Grace swallowed hard. What? You're fired. The words echoed through the cafe. She slowly untied her apron and placed it neatly on the counter. Her hand shook, but her voice remained steady. I hope one day you remember that businesses are built on people, not appearances. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door. As she reached it, the elderly man stood. Miss Parker. She turned. Thank you, he said simply. She smiled through her tears. You don't have to thank me. It was the right thing to do. Grace stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, believing she had just lost everything. Behind her, the elderly man calmly took out an old flip phone and made one brief call. I've seen enough, he said. Within moments, the distant rumble of powerful engines echoed down the street. The cafe windows began to vibrate. Dozens of heads turned toward the parking lot as a convoy of black SUVs approached in perfect formation. Inside the cafe, the manager suddenly realized that the customer he had dismissed so casually might be someone far more important than anyone had imagined. The convoy came to a smooth stop in front of the cafe. 1, 2, 5, 10. By the time the last black SUV parked, the entire street had fallen silent. People walking on the sidewalk stopped to watch. Drivers slowed their cars. Inside the cafe, every employee stood frozen, staring through the windows. The manager forced a nervous laugh. This has to be some kind of mistake. No one answered. The doors of the first SUV opened in perfect unison. Men and women dressed in tailored black suits stepped out with disciplined precision. They weren't loud or intimidating, they simply moved with the quiet confidence of people who had been trained to protect someone important. Each wore an earpiece. Each scanned the area carefully before taking position. Then the rear door of the center SUV opened. A distinguished man in his 60s stepped out. His charcoal suit was immaculate, and his calm expression carried the kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. He walked directly toward the elderly customer. Without hesitation, he gave a respectful nod. Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti. Every breath inside the cafe seemed to stop. The elderly man smiled faintly. Good afternoon, Victor. Victor glanced around the cafe, his expression settling briefly on the manager before returning to the older man. Is everything all right? The elderly man looked toward the front door where Grace had disappeared only moments earlier. I found the person I was looking for. The words confused everyone. The businessman who had demanded the old man's removal suddenly stepped forward, forcing an awkward smile. Sir, if there has been some misunderstanding, I'm sure we can clear it up. The elderly man slowly turned toward him. What misunderstanding? I didn't realize. You didn't realize what? The businessman struggled to answer. I thought. You thought my clothes determined my worth. The businessman lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. The The elderly man studied him for a long moment. The apology isn't for me. His gaze shifted to the manager. And neither is yours. The manager's confidence had completely vanished. I only wanted to protect the reputation of the cafe. The reputation of a business, the elderly man replied calmly, is built by how it treats people with the least influence, not the most. Silence followed. Even the coffee machine seemed quieter. Finally, the elderly man reached into his jacket and removed a simple leather wallet. He placed a black business card on the nearest table. The manager picked it up with trembling hands. His face instantly lost all color. The name printed in silver letters was one almost everyone in the city recognized. Antonio Moretti. A businessman to the public. A philanthropist to countless charities. A private investor whose companies employed thousands. And, according to endless whispers that had never been proven, the man who quietly controlled one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the region. No one dared say the last part aloud. They didn't need to. The room suddenly understood why an entire security convoy had arrived after a single phone call. Antonio noticed the fear spreading across their faces. He sighed softly. It's remarkable. No one spoke. I walked into this cafe dressed exactly as I am today. He gently brushed a speck of dust from his old jacket. I ordered coffee. I paid. I smiled. And yet most of you decided who I was before I spoke 10 words. The businessman looked ready to disappear. Antonio continued. I wear these clothes on purpose. Confused expressions spread through the room. Once every few months, I leave behind the expensive cars, tailored suits, and public appearances. Do you know why? No one answered. Because money attracts manners. He paused. But character appears only when people think you have none. His eyes softened. Today, only one person passed that test. Grace. Antonio looked toward Victor. Find her. Victor nodded immediately. We've already begun. The manager hurried around the counter. Please, if you tell her it was a misunderstanding, I'll hire her back immediately. Antonio looked at him without anger. No. The manager blinked. No. You believe giving someone back the job you unfairly took is generosity. Antonio shook his head. It isn't. It's simply correcting your own mistake. Outside, Grace was slowly walking toward the bus stop, wiping away tears she didn't want Ethan to see later that evening. She was already trying to figure out how she would explain losing her job to her son. Behind her, a sleek black SUV rolled quietly to the curb. Victor stepped out first. Miss Grace Parker. Grace instinctively tightened her grip on her purse. Yes? Victor smiled politely. Mr. Antonio Moretti would like to speak with you. Grace glanced at the long line of black vehicles stretching down the street. Her heart began to race. She had no idea why one of the city's most powerful men wanted to see her. But something told her that the worst day of her life was about to become the most unexpected turning point she had ever imagined. Grace stared at Victor, certain he had mistaken her for someone else. I think you have the wrong person, she said cautiously. Victor smiled. I assure you, Miss Parker, I don't. He stepped aside and gestured toward the waiting SUV. Mr. Moretti would appreciate a few minutes of your time. Grace glanced at the line of black vehicles, then back toward the cafe where she had just lost her job. Her heart was still pounding. I don't have a lawyer, she admitted quietly. If this is about what happened inside, I wasn't trying to cause trouble. Victor's expression softened. Mr. Moretti isn't upset with you. Then, why does he want to see me? I believe he'd rather tell you himself. Grace hesitated. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan's after-school program reminding parents that pickup was at 5 o'clock. She looked at the time. There were still several hours before she needed to collect him. Taking a deep breath, she nodded. All right. But only for a little while. Victor opened the rear door. Antonio Moretti was already seated inside. He smiled warmly as Grace climbed in. Thank you for coming. Grace sat carefully across from him. I wasn't sure I should. Most people wouldn't have. The SUV pulled away smoothly, leaving the cafe behind. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Antonio broke the silence. Why did you defend me? Grace looked at him, surprised. Because you hadn't done anything wrong. It cost you your job. I know. And if you could go back. Grace didn't even pause. I'd do the same thing. Antonio nodded slowly, almost as though he had expected that answer. My mother used to say that integrity is most valuable when it becomes expensive. Grace smiled faintly. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. The convoy traveled through the city before turning through a pair of tall wrought iron gates. Grace's eyes widened. Beyond them stood a breathtaking estate surrounded by ancient oak trees, fountains, and carefully tended gardens. The mansion wasn't flashy. It was elegant. Timeless. This is your home, she asked. Antonio chuckled. It's simply the place where I sleep. As they entered, several household staff greeted Antonio respectfully. He acknowledged each by name. Grace noticed something unusual. Despite the size of the estate, the atmosphere felt quiet. Almost lonely. Antonio led her into a bright sitting room overlooking a rose garden. I'd like you to meet someone. Before Grace could ask who, a little girl peeked around the doorway. She couldn't have been older than 7. She clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Her dark curls framed a cautious face, and her large brown eyes studied Grace without saying a word. This is Isabella, Antonio said gently. My granddaughter. Grace smiled warmly. Hello, Isabella. The little girl didn't answer. Instead, she disappeared behind the doorway. Grace looked apologetically at Antonio. I'm sorry. You've done nothing wrong. He sighed. She hasn't spoken to a stranger in almost a year. Grace's expression softened. What happened? Antonio looked toward the window. She lost both of her parents in a car accident. The room fell silent. Since then, she barely speaks. She refuses teachers, nannies, therapists, everyone. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. I'm so sorry. At that moment, a small voice quietly asked, Do you like rabbits? Grace turned. Isabella had returned, still clutching her stuffed animal. Grace smiled. I do. I had one when I was little. What was its name? Mr. Buttons. For the first time, Isabella smiled. A tiny smile. But a real one. Antonio noticed immediately. So did every member of the household standing discreetly nearby. One of the maids quietly covered her mouth in surprise. She smiled, she whispered. Antonio's eyes glistened. He hadn't seen that smile in months. Isabella slowly walked closer. Can I show you my garden? Grace looked toward Antonio. He simply nodded. I'd love that. For nearly 30 minutes, Grace and Isabella wandered through the gardens. They talked about flowers, butterflies, and the little girl's favorite books. They laughed when a butterfly landed on Mr. Rabbit's floppy ear. Watching from the terrace, Antonio folded his hands behind his back. Victor approached quietly. I've never seen Miss Isabella open up to someone so quickly. Neither have I, Antonio replied. When Grace returned, Isabella surprised everyone by gently taking her hand. Will you come back tomorrow? Grace's heart melted. She knelt beside the little girl. If your grandfather wants me to. Antonio stepped forward. As a matter of fact, He paused. "I was hoping to ask you something." Grace stood. "I know you need a job. I also know that no amount of money can replace character." He looked at Isabella, who still refused to let go of Grace's hand. "I'd like to offer you a position here." Grace blinked. "What kind of position?" "Be Isabella's companion and caregiver. You won't just look after her. You'll help her smile again." Grace was speechless. Antonio continued. "The salary will be 3 times what you earned at the cafe. We'll provide health insurance. Flexible hours so you can always be there for your son. And Ethan will always be welcome here." Grace felt tears gathering in her eyes. It sounded too good to be true. But before she could answer, she noticed someone watching from the second-floor balcony. A sharply dressed man stood in the shadows, his expression cold and unreadable. Unlike everyone else in the house, he didn't look happy to see Grace. Grace accepted Antonio's offer the following morning. It wasn't an easy decision. She had spent the entire night weighing the risks. Working for one of the city's most influential businessmen, whose name was surrounded by rumors, wasn't something she had ever imagined. But every time she thought about Ethan's future, and every time she remembered Isabella's hopeful smile, her answer became clearer. She wasn't accepting the job because of Antonio's wealth. She was accepting because one lonely little girl needed someone who genuinely cared. Within a week, the atmosphere at the Moretti estate had begun to change. The once quiet halls echoed with laughter again. Grace and Isabella spent their mornings reading stories in the library, baking cookies in the kitchen, and tending the rose garden. Ethan often joined them after school, and before long, he and Isabella became inseparable. Antonio watched the transformation with quiet gratitude. For the first time since losing his son and daughter-in-law, he heard his granddaughter laugh without forcing it. The servants noticed it too. "Miss Parker has brought life back into this house," one housekeeper whispered. Not everyone shared that opinion. From his office overlooking the courtyard, Damien Cross, Antonio's longtime chief advisor, watched Grace through the window. For nearly 20 years, Damien had managed Antonio's business affairs and controlled access to him. Staff members sought Damien's approval before making even the smallest decisions. Now things were changing. Antonio asked Grace's opinion during meals. Isabella wanted Grace nearby every day. Even Ethan's cheerful presence seemed to brighten Antonio's evenings. Damien didn't like losing influence. One afternoon, Victor found Damien staring at Grace and Isabella playing outside. "You seem troubled," Victor remarked. Damien forced a smile. "I'm simply concerned." "About what?" "We know almost nothing about this woman." Victor folded his arms. "We've completed a background check. And she's exactly who she says she is. A hardworking single mother. No criminal record. No hidden debts beyond ordinary bills. No suspicious connections." Damien nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting." But his eyes revealed something else entirely. Envy. That evening, Antonio hosted a small dinner for several charitable partners. Before the guests arrived, Isabella insisted that Grace wear a beautiful sapphire pendant that had belonged to Antonio's late wife. "It's lucky," Isabella said with a smile. Grace hesitated. "It's far too valuable." Antonio smiled warmly. "My wife believed jewelry only had meaning when it was shared." Grace accepted it carefully. The evening passed peacefully. Guests praised Isabella's confidence and remarked on how much happier she seemed. Antonio couldn't have been prouder. The following morning, however, the entire mansion erupted into confusion. The sapphire pendant was gone. Staff searched every room. Drawers were emptied. Hallways filled with anxious whispers. Finally, Damien entered the sitting room carrying a small velvet pouch. "I found it." Everyone looked at him. It was inside Miss Parker's handbag. Grace stared in disbelief. "What?" Damien opened the pouch. The sapphire pendant sparkled inside. "I've never seen that before," Grace whispered. Antonio remained silent. Grace looked directly into his eyes. "I didn't take it." "I believe you," Antonio replied calmly. Damien frowned. "With respect, sir, the evidence." Antonio raised a hand. "Evidence should answer questions. It should not end them." Grace took a slow breath. "May I ask something?" "Of course." "Were the security cameras checked?" Damien answered before anyone else could. "Unfortunately, there was a technical malfunction." Victor's eyes narrowed. "A malfunction?" "Yes." "Convenient timing." Damien's expression remained calm. "Technology fails." Grace looked around the room, refusing to panic. Someone wanted her gone. Someone had planted the necklace. The question was why. As silence settled over the room, a tiny voice spoke from the doorway. "I saw it." Every head turned. Isabella stood there holding her tablet. She looked nervous but determined. Antonio immediately knelt beside her. "What did you see, sweetheart?" "I was making videos for Grandma's flowers." She held up the tablet. "I forgot it was recording." Victor quickly took the device and opened the video. The room fell completely silent. The recording showed Grace leaving her handbag on a chair while helping Isabella in the garden. Several minutes later, Damien quietly entered the room. He looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then he opened Grace's handbag, placed the velvet pouch inside, closed it, and walked away as if nothing had happened. The video ended. No one spoke. Antonio slowly stood. His disappointment was unmistakable. 20 years, he said quietly. "I trusted you for 20 years." Damien's face turned pale. "Sir, I can explain." Antonio shook his head. "No. You can leave." Damien took a desperate step forward. "I was protecting this family." "No," Antonio replied firmly. "You were protecting your position." Victor stepped beside Damien. "You should go." As Damien was escorted toward the front door, he looked back at Grace with undisguised resentment. This isn't over. Grace felt a chill run through her. She had been cleared. But somehow, she knew Damien wasn't finished causing trouble. Damien's words lingered in Grace's mind for days. This isn't over. Although Antonio assured her that Victor had strengthened security around the estate, Grace couldn't completely shake the uneasy feeling. Still, she refused to let fear steal the happiness Isabella had finally found. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Every afternoon, Ethan arrived after school and raced into the gardens with Isabella. They built birdhouses, planted vegetables, and laughed as they tried to teach Antonio's old golden retriever new tricks. For the first time in years, Grace wasn't constantly worrying about overdue bills. She had time to help Ethan with his homework. She could cook dinner without wondering whether there would be enough food for the next day. More importantly, she could breathe. One Friday evening, Antonio invited Grace and Ethan to dinner in the mansion's library. A fire crackled softly in the fireplace as shelves lined with old books surrounded them. After dessert, Antonio placed a large cream-colored envelope on the table. "I have something for you." Grace looked at it curiously. "What is it?" "Open it." She carefully unfolded the documents inside. At first, they didn't make sense. Then she recognized the address. It was her small house. Her eyes widened. "I don't understand." Antonio smiled gently. "The mortgage has been paid in full." Grace stared at him. "What?" "The house is yours. No monthly payments. No remaining debt." She looked from the papers to Antonio, unable to speak. Tears filled her eyes. You bought my house. I purchased the loan from the bank. And then I cancelled it. Grace covered her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. I can't accept this. Antonio leaned forward. Yes, you can. She shook her head. It's too much. No. He smiled warmly. It's exactly enough. Grace struggled to find words. Why would you do something like this for me? Antonio looked toward Isabella and Ethan, who were quietly putting together a puzzle near the fireplace. When my family needed hope, he said softly, you gave it to us. You never asked who I was. You never cared what I owned. You simply chose kindness. He paused. People spend their lives searching for loyal, honest hearts. I've learned they're much rarer than money. Grace wiped away her tears. I only did what anyone should have done. Antonio chuckled. If that were true, we never would have met. He reached into the envelope once more and handed Grace another folder. She blinked. There's more. Antonio nodded. I recently expanded the Moretti Family Foundation. Grace looked through the papers. The foundation funded food banks, shelters, scholarships, and emergency assistance for struggling families. I'd like you to become its executive director. Grace looked up in disbelief. Me? You understand hardship. You understand dignity. And you understand that helping someone isn't charity, it's respect. The foundation needs someone with those values. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. I've never run an organization. Antonio smiled. You'll learn. You already possess the one quality that can't be taught. Character. Months passed. Under Grace's leadership, the foundation opened community kitchens, supported single parents returning to school, and created scholarships for children who had lost a parent. News outlets across the city began covering the foundation's work. One afternoon, a local television station aired a feature titled, Former Waitress Leads Foundation Changing Hundreds of Lives. At the cafe where it had all begun, the television hung silently above the counter. The manager stopped polishing a coffee mug as Grace's face appeared on the screen. Customers applauded after watching the interview. One regular customer quietly asked, Isn't she the waitress you fired? The manager lowered his eyes. Yes. Another employee sighed. She was the best person who ever worked here. The manager nodded slowly. I know. For the first time, he understood that the greatest mistake he had ever made wasn't losing an excellent employee. It was judging someone's worth by circumstances instead of character. Back at the foundation, Grace stood outside the new community center as families filled the playground with laughter. Antonio joined her, watching children run freely across the grass. You've accomplished more in 6 months than most people do in a lifetime, he said. Grace smiled. I couldn't have done it without someone believing in me. Antonio shook his head. I didn't create your character, Grace. I simply recognized it. Nearby, Ethan and Isabella raced toward them, laughing as they chased a bright red kite dancing high in the afternoon sky. Grace watched them with a grateful heart. Not long ago, she had walked out of a cafe believing she had lost everything. Instead, by choosing compassion over convenience, she had found a new purpose, a new family, and a future she had never dared to imagine. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness opens the door to the biggest change. Because true character isn't revealed when life is easy. It's revealed in the moments when doing the right thing comes at the greatest cost. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, justice, redemption, and unforgettable twists. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life every week. Until our next story, remember, kindness is never wasted, and true character always leaves a lasting legacy. Thank you for watching Boss Legacy Stories. We'll see you in the next video.